Hi, Jim Cantelon here. Welcome to Jim Cantelon Today. Today and all this week, I'm going to be interviewing pastors, which I think is a terrific idea. Three of them, at least, are quite young. One is maybe middle-aged, but all with vital ministries in key cities across this nation. J.D. Mallory is my guest today. Now, he has just for the past year and a bit been pastor of the amazing and vital Stone Church right in the epicenter of downtown Toronto. And his is an interesting story because he came from pastoring in the retirement culture of Naples, Florida, to the creative cauldron of downtown Toronto, not just from beautiful warm temperature, and in his case coming in February to minus 20 degrees, but from a very kind of sleepy, lovely retirement city to this vital, engine that is Toronto, one of the top 5 cities in the world. And he comes in and has been going through a kind of a culture shift, if not a culture shock, but he's a very, very interesting guy. And I'm going to be interviewing him and talking to him about not just the move from southern Florida to Toronto, but about ministry in Toronto in general. So you won't want to miss this. J.D. Mallory's coming up right after this break.
This is a Voice of the Martyrs Canada news update, a special report.
What began with anti-government protests escalated into a full-scale civil war involving the brutal tactics of Islamic State jihadist militants. More than 200,000 Syrians have lost their lives in 4+ years of armed conflict. About a quarter of them were Christians. In spite of all they've had to go through, Karima says their faith in Jesus hasn't wavered.
God is with us wherever we go.
Tens of thousands of Christians have died in the war since 2011. Despite the dangers, the Voice of the Martyrs Canada has been able to help persecuted Christians in Syria, providing food, supplies, Bibles, and prayer.
For more information, visit www.vomcanada.com.
J.D. Mallory is the lead pastor of Stone Church in Toronto. Stone Church is right in the heart of Canada's biggest city. An incredible location, J.D. You've been there a year. You came there from Naples, Florida.
Yeah.
You came, as I recall, when we had lunch together last winter, I think it was 27 below and the wind was blowing.
Yes.
And you just come from Naples. And I
God
said,
has a sense of humor.
Yeah. I asked you how you were doing, and you said, you're having a wonderful time. You're laughing all the time. You're so happy.
You got it.
Why are you so happy?
Well, I get to serve Jesus,
Yeah.
and you get to be in a missional field. And when that's what you want to do, wherever God positions you, you're going to learn to love and enjoy where you're at. If not, there's always going to be something to get frustrated about. But the cold was great. I had a little 4-wheel drive Jeep, and so I was going sideways down the streets of Toronto and looking at everything, getting accustomed to the climate and the culture. But it's been quite a ride in the last year and 3 months.
Yeah. Now, you refer to Stone as being a missional setting. Some people be surprised by that. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, if you say, okay, what does Canada look like? Well, some people get something in their minds, and you have to say, well, what does Toronto look like? And you're going to get a much different picture. The context of our ministry, you have to see it through a missional lens. In fact, my wife, she teases, she said, if you would have told me that we were going on the mission field before I said we're moving from South Florida to Toronto, it would have been an easier transition, because we do have such a diversity throughout the city that is really the fabric of what makes Toronto. And so kind of the fabric of Toronto is a mixture of hundreds of different cultures, language groups, and they're everywhere, and they're pocketed all throughout the city.
And you're surrounded by, I call them vertical villages.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't know how many, 10, 15 condos within about a kilometer of your place?
It depends which month you are.
Yeah, because there's cranes and stuff going up all the time.
They're going all the time. Around our facility right now, we have 2 more brand new projects that are just underground right now.
The church itself has been around a long time.
Yes.
It's got a strong DNA in terms of world outreach missions, historically a strong preaching center. How have you found the church itself?
Well, the church had been in a difficult period of transition, and you had been a part of that transition, helping the church to heal and go through some difficult times. And it was really like a diamond in the rough. I just felt when my wife and I first got there, we walked on the campus and started to meet some of the people and see some of the faces and listen. And I tell you, one of the things that really challenged me, when I was in South Florida, I'd heard about Stone Church and heard there was a need, and I'm praying about, what to do. And I made the mistake of Google Earthing it, okay? Yeah. And so I've got my computer, and I look down, and I see this dot in the middle of this massive city, and it's not just Canada's largest city. It's the greatest city in the world. I mean, this is what we've just seen recently. But I see this dot in the middle of this amazing, expansive city, and I just began to weep in my heart. God, that has to be an epicenter for you to do something, because from that epicenter, that ground zero place, we have the opportunity to affect spiritual change, not just through Toronto, not just through Canada, but because of the missional aspect, we can really touch the world right from where we are.
Yeah, and your location is just stunning. I mean, you're in Yorkville, but you're right there between Yonge Street and Bloor Street. It couldn't be more centrally located if you tried. You're surrounded by various outreach missions, street ministries, Yonge Street Mission, Scott Street Mission. You've got University of Toronto. You have Ryerson, and the congregation full of students and progressive young people, as well as great, sharp young families, as well as older folk. I mean, it really is a fantastic situation. Now, let me ask you this. Even though you were born in Miami, your parents are Canadian, your wife is Canadian, but you had not had a lot of experience with Canada, and yet you're not exactly foreign to what's north of the 49th parallel.
Right.
What would you say is the essential culture gap that you have had to, maybe you're still bridging, in terms of ministry in the U.S. and ministry in Canada?
Well, I think more than just a culture gap, there seems to be, as far as if we're talking about Christian culture, I think there has been a paradigm shift that a lot of churches have got lost in. And so what happens is you see it whether you're in Canada, the U.S., there's lots of similarities where you'll go and you'll see churches that seem to have almost been time capsulized. It's like they were crafted in a moment, and that moment kind of stayed there. And so when you open up the doors, you see wonderful, beautiful people, but they're almost trapped in a moment. And we're trying to break through that barrier. And when in Toronto, for instance, when you look at the city, fast-paced, very aggressive, entrepreneurial in every aspect. I mean, the city is just going at it. And the church has to model the same way. The church of today, it doesn't matter where you're at, the church of today has to be very entrepreneurial. They have to keep in pace with the culture. And we have to learn to speak the cultural language. I mean, just as Jesus did. He spoke the language of the culture. He took the absolute truth, and that's what we have. But it's trying to figure out how to take absolute truth, craft it in a language that the culture understands, make it palatable to our city, and to go after that. And so that has been some of the disconnect in a lot of ministries we see throughout North America. And in our church, we've been growing very fast. We've got a lot of amazing things happening, and some people say, well, JD, what's taking place? And I said, listen, we're trying to be like Jesus. And we're trying to sound like Jesus and talk like Jesus. We're not trying to sound like a particular era that was comfortable or successful. We're trying to be current to the moment we're in right now.
Your wife, Krista, is a key component in your ministry, Signature. She worked with you very closely in Naples. Yeah. Is she doing the same at Stone? Yeah,
she really is. And she works a lot in helping our ministries to have alignment. Everything has to flow in and out of our missional values. And so everything we do is love God, love people, make disciples. That's all we're doing. So if something within our ministry context does not fit into one of those values, we don't do it anymore. And that's been a problem because, you know, in ministry, sometimes people have the sacred cow. I mean, this is what we love. We've been doing it for years and years. Well, unless it fits the value, and we find those values in Scripture, and unless it fits the design that God has for us. We think of Ephesians 2:10. I mean, God, before time began, He crafted us with a design, a purpose. And so that purpose is to love God, love people, make disciples. And so she really helps to make sure we have alignment throughout all of our ministries.
What are your preaching values? When you're looking to prepare a sermon, what is it that matters to you most in terms of that preparation, and then secondly, in terms of its delivery to your people?
Well, it's got to be about transformation. You know, it's not just about telling a story. It's not just about communicating a truth. It's leading people to a place of transformation. Something we do, it's kind of old school. I make it possible every service for people to experience a transformation, whether it's salvation for the first time, receiving prayer for a situation in their lives. But everything has to lead in that direction. We are not content to just give a positive message. We're not just content to tell an entertaining story. Now, in our church, people laugh a lot. We have a good time. You've been there. I love to preach. I love to share with people. But we always want to bring people to a place of transformation. And when you are encountered with the love of God, you can't help to receive transformation. This past Sunday, at the end of the service, I went to the altar myself, and just people from our church just gathered around, and we were just seeking God together. Because we want to have that moment where people, when they come in and say, listen, I know God's speaking to me, I know something's happening, I need God to do a work in my life. We want to make sure that people have that opportunity.
So you assume, and I think correctly, that people are coming to the church because they need the Lord. They need some kind of a connection, some kind of an encouragement, some kind of hope, some kind of healing, some kind of saving influence. They're not coming just to be there.
Well, I've been pastoring for 25 years. I've never had a perfect person show up to church yet. You know, so that's part of that reality, that we have broken individuals that come into the fellowship. We want to make sure that that fellowship is open and receptive to them, but then offer hope and healing.
J.D. Mallory is the lead pastor of Stone Church, downtown Toronto. If you are a Toronto viewer and you're looking for a church, you can't go wrong. Just check out Stone Church. Google it. Find it on Google Earth. And J.D. will welcome you at the door. Thanks so much, J.D. I'll be back with more right after this.
Very few African mothers ever see a doctor or midwife, yet each mother knows how fragile her child's life is. You see, 26,000 children under the age of 5 will die today because they don't have access to medical care. Your gift of $260, just $22 every month, helps stock a mobile clinic and train healthcare workers to care for young mothers and their children during pregnancy and preschool years. Join WOW Mother Care now. Protect the life of a mother and her child.
Hey, we're on to chapter 12. Can you believe it? Now chapter 13. And 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 are a kind of continuum here that is focused on the Passover Seder, all right? And it's just before the Passover festival. And I've dug into this, and it seems to me that Jesus is having this Passover meal with his disciples maybe a day in advance of the normal Passover Seder evening, because Jesus dies, on the day of preparation, which would be the Friday of that week, and then the Passover Seder was at that year at the same time as the natural Sabbath, which is Friday night through to Saturday night. I'm not going to be dogmatic about this, but I'm just trying to understand the chronology here. But anyway, in verse 1, we read, it was just before the Passover festival, okay? Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, I love this. Isn't this cool? He loved them to the end. I'm going to spend more time on that in a minute. Just in case you're not familiar with Passover, and a lot of you aren't. I shouldn't assume that you are. I'm very aware of Passover because, as many of you know, for 7 years, Kathy and I and our children lived in Jerusalem, Israel, where the Israeli government had invited me to plant a church, which we did. You can now Google it. It's called King of Kings, Jerusalem. Great, thriving church, wonderful chapter in our life story, and I love it every time I get back there. Passover occurs in the Jewish month of Nisan, Nisan, and it's usually on the 14th or 15th day of that month. Nisan happens equivalent to our April, and there is some fluctuation, from days and weeks depending on the calendar and the year. But Passover refers to the key festival of the Jewish faith, which is a commemoration of the events occurring when God delivered Israel out of 400 years of bondage in Egypt. And you read about that in Exodus. It's an amazing story, how God used Moses, who had been raised an Egyptian, and then spent several decades in the desert, married basically a desert dweller's daughter, and came back to Egypt to lead his own people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt to the Promised Land. And between that Passover, which was marked with some remarkable portents and signs and wonders, between that time and the actual entry into the Promised Land, which is Canaan or Palestine, there was 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. It's an amazing epic, and you can read all about it for yourself in the scripture. Keeping in mind that as Moses revealed the law of God to these people, it was a law being revealed to a bunch of desert dwellers who had no permanent home. A lot of these laws anticipated the time when they would have permanent homes, but there's all kinds of laws there that relate to just the ins and outs, the daily stresses, exigencies of life, in the wilderness without proper sanitation, without enough water, with food that was miraculously supplied by God. Otherwise, they would have starved. But anyway, that's for another study, okay? The Passover is something, as a remembrance, is something that's been happening every year since that Passover occurred. And even to this day, Jewish people around the world on Passover celebrate what's called the Passover Seder. And they sit at the table and they remember what God did in delivering them from Egypt. There's special food that's prepared. There's a special Haggadah, as it's called. It's a special Passover liturgy. It's about 60 pages in length. If you do the whole Haggadah, it takes about 4 hours. And usually it's the senior family member, a male family member, who leads through that liturgy. There's a lot of singing. There's 4 cups of wine. There's various foods that are enjoyed. There's one moment where the children go off in search of what's called the afikoman. It's some unleavened bread that's been hidden by the father or the mother somewhere in the house, and the child who finds it gets some kind of special reward. But it's an all-night deal. And most Jewish families have a truncated version of the Seder because the kids lose interest, after maybe an hour or two and start wandering off. And what was really fun when we were in Jerusalem, we have some very special Jewish friends there who started inviting us from day one to their Seder. And our 3 kids just loved it and would hang in there for the entire Haggadah. And the man of the house just loved this because his own kids were going off. Our kids, the Gentiles, were staying for the whole thing. And because our kids grew up in Israel, they spoke Hebrew fluently, and so they were able to follow along, sing the songs, do everything in the Hebrew language. So Passover has a lot of warm feelings for Kath and I and our family. And certainly if you're Jewish or you have Jewish friends or relatives, you know what a significant celebration it is. Even the most secular of Jews will celebrate Passover. So that's what we're dealing with here. This was the key festival of the Jewish year. And Jesus, who was Jewish, and his disciples who were Jewish, celebrated it in the city of the great King, Jerusalem. And what a place to have a Passover Seder, all right? So, Jesus knew, John says, that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. we've been talking about the hour, and the hour had finally arrived when the Greeks said to Philip, "We would see Jesus." And as soon as the Gentile world, if you will, came seeking Jesus, Jesus knew that his hour had come. And the hour doesn't comprise just his arrest and crucifixion, but it also includes his resurrection and his ascension to the Father. And so this hour, which refers to a period of time, really comprised an actual time, maybe 41, 42 days, 43 days, right? But he's on his way to the Father. Having loved his own who are in the world, and referring, of course, specifically to his inner core of disciples, John says he loved them to the end. Now, there's a hint here of self-recrimination on John's part, because we know from the story that when Jesus was arrested and taken before Annas, who was the senior religious leader in Jerusalem, he was the retired chief priest. His son Caiaphas had taken over as chief priest, but they brought him to Annas first because he was still alive and he had the seniority, and then to Caiaphas. When that happened, the disciples began to fall away. Peter, as you know, denied him. We'll be getting to that in a few study sessions. But when he died on Calvary's cross, none of them were to be found, other than this guy, John, who appears at the foot of the cross just as Jesus is dying. And Jesus says to his mother, Mary, "Mother, behold your son, and son, behold your mother." In other words, he gave to John the responsibility of caring for his mom, which tells us, among other things, that Joseph had died. Otherwise, Joseph would be caring for Mary, right? Having said all that, even though they didn't love him to the end, Jesus loved them to the end. He was totally loyal, and his love was unshakable. And this will emerge again as we get into the story in the upper room. Okay, so verse 2. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. What is going on here? Well, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. This is strange behavior indeed, or maybe it's not. Again, cultural context helps. In those days, you didn't have taxis, you didn't have cars, you didn't have buses, you had no kinds of public transport. You might have had a donkey to ride once in a while, but generally speaking, you got around by walking. And I lived in Israel for 7 years. I know what walking around Israel is like. Within minutes, your feet are totally dusty. I'm talking about my running shoes, and right up to about halfway up to your knees, you're covered in dust. There's this fine talcum powder-like dust that pervades the atmosphere. In fact, on occasion, when you live in Jerusalem, you get what's called a hamsin. And a hamsin is a dust storm. And this dust storm will come into town. You'll see it in the distance, and then as it comes in, it just envelops you in a fog of dust. The dust is so fine you can't see it, except that your vision is cut down to maybe 100 meters, and you can close your windows, close your doors, and you'll notice within a few hours that even inside your closed house, there's dust everywhere. It can penetrate anything, finds its way through the smallest cracks in the plaster or orifices, around the windows. Hamsin, dust. That kind of dust permeates the atmosphere. And when you walk in Jerusalem, you walk in Israel generally, as I have done for hours and hours and hours over the years, it's a dusty prospect. And so, when you come into someone's place for a bite to eat, as was the case here, you would come in dusty of foot. And next time, we'll talk about how they would deal with that dust.
This is a Voice of the Martyrs Canada news update, a special report.
More than 200,000 Syrians have lost their lives in 4+ years of armed conflict. About a quarter of them were Christians. Prior to the uprising and then the war, there were about 3 million Christians in the country. About half of them have left, and most of the rest want to leave as well.
It breaks my heart to see what is happening to my nation with all the terrorism and the violence among the people.
If you would have come to Syria before, you would have seen how it was full of churches and beautiful Christian places, and now it's all gone. It's all destroyed.
Amani was encouraged by the concern and support of the Voice of the Martyrs Canada, but is pleading with Christians everywhere to continue to pray.
For more information, visit www.vomcanada.com.
I liked what Pastor J.D. Mallory of Stone Church, Toronto said about his view of the church. If I can quote him, he refers to it as a place of transformation. Very apropos. Søren Kierkegaard, the famous Danish theologian philosopher, once wrote, where mere mental assent to a doctrine is not enough. Where there's no transformation, there's no Christianity. The thing we've got to, accept when we're talking about Christian faith is that Jesus is out to change us. And if there's one thing that human nature generally resists, it's change. Not only do babies resist being changed, but adults resist being changed. We kind of like to settle into how we see things, what's comfortable for us, what seems to have worked in the past, and just kind of stay there. Transformation, on the other hand, calls us to onward and upward. Life is never just continuing. It's always a growth process, and there's always a far horizon to pursue. And I think that that's got to be part and parcel with what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Life here on earth is just the beginning. It is certainly not the end story by any stretch. We are destined as believers to eternal life, as the scripture puts it, a life that will be a forever life with the Lord. And so when we're talking about faith here, it's not just a philosophical assent to a doctrine. It's an actual commitment to being changed, literally changed from death unto life. Thanks for watching today. I'm Jim Cantelon. We'll see you again next time.
Contact us. Jim Cantelon today. P.O. Box 989, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 3Y7. If you're sending a check, make it payable to Jim Cantelon today. Or visit us online at jimcantelontoday.com and click Support.